Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Secure Talk. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I'll be your host for this episode of Secure Talk. Today, we're going to be talking to Kiran Vangaveti, who is the founder and CEO of BluSapphire Technology. And we're going to talk about the current threat landscape, some of the different trends in cybersecurity, and we might also get into something totally different, talk about Kiran's adventures running marathons. But first off, let's welcome Kiran. Kiran, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me to the podcast, Mark.
My pleasure. And where are you located today?
Today, I'm in Hyderabad, India.
So I have a question for you because I can never really figure out Indian time zones. And I mean, first off, there's just one time zone for all of India. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, and I think it's Indian Standard Time. Is that what it's referred to?
Absolutely true.
Okay, so I'm in the US and we have 4 different time zones, and some states do daylight savings and some states don't. So it's really a mess. Explain to me this. Why is as far as I know, it's the only country or time zone where you're not exactly lined on the hour. It's on it's 30 minutes off of all the other time zones. Why is that?
So I think we've learned a lot from the countries that have done this before. And based on the latitude that we took the closest one that runs through Calcutta, which used to be one of the heads of British when British used to rule. Mm-hmm. And that became the time zone for the entire country.
It makes sense, and it makes as much sense as any of the explanations that we get in the US when we ask, why do we have daylight savings? Why do we have to set the clocks forward and set them back 2 times a year just to mess with people? And you get all kinds of different reasons. Do you guys change your time? Do you have any type of daylight savings, or is it always the same?
Thankfully, it's always the same. So
yes,
we always wake up the same time of the day and go to bed around the same time of the night. Yes, there is early sunset and late sunrises in the winters, especially in the northern parts of India. It's more common, but it still follows the same time zone.
Yeah, and I think we're working towards that in the U.S. A bill just passed the Senate almost unanimously, which nothing goes through U.S. politics unanimously these days. But everybody's like, we've had enough of this. So hopefully we'll get it passed and we'll be on the same type of system that you're on there. But hey, that's not what we set up this call to talk about. We wanted to talk about your experience with cybersecurity. Maybe before we jump into the kind of the current threat landscape, could you just give a quick overview of what BluSapphire Technologies does?
Absolutely. BluSapphire is the first unified cyber defense platform. So what we kind of try and do is security operations that is responsible for majority of the defense that happens in an organization is often burdened with trying to understand what each of these threats are, what is the context, how do we respond, how do we remediate, how do we detect, how do we get the context, how is triage performed. We automate all of those tasks under a single unified platform without having to rely on multiple tools. The idea really came to me when I was working with GE Capital headquarters with 6 business units under us. More often than not, it was not a question of resources or budgets. For us, it was more of a problem of capability of the tools we were working with, and the disparate set of tools we were working with almost made it a nightmare to get any data set out. So even when we detect a nation state attack, for us to figure out, is this the only one that we're seeing, or are there others? And is this the only instance? Are there other instances? And did the attacker only reveal himself here? Are there anything else that he has done which he has not revealed himself? Gathering that data took us days, if not weeks in most cases. And that's what drove me to build that platform. So these things can actually be done relatively much faster in a matter of seconds as opposed to the days and weeks. So that everybody, when we started, said that's impossible. Today, if you look at the security landscape, everybody is moving towards that unified platform. So we're happy we're on the right path.
So when you say unified platform, maybe you can color in all the different components that you're talking about. I mean, typically, I mean, we've all seen the statistics that an average enterprise works with 30, 40, 50 different security vendors. I think that number might be getting smaller these days. But when you talk about unified, you're talking about like bringing almost all of that into one basically platform. But what are the key components of that platform?
Thanks for that question. What we usually do in the security landscape is we divide this security defense structure architecture into two structures, right? A basic defense stack and an advanced defense stack. A basic defense stack is purely there to keep the noise out. It's like you build a wall around your house just to keep the noise out, the animals and the others out. It doesn't really protect you against somebody who is dedicated on jumping the fence, right? So the advanced cyber defense stack is really put in place to address those kind of issues. There, we're talking about some kind of a logging mechanism, centralized logging, so everything can be looked at. In most cases, it's either a SIM or something of that sort. Understanding the network behaviors is another layer. Using machine learning and artificial intelligence to understand the data points you're looking at. Looking probably processes in isolation to understand what they do. In most cases, when an attacker attacks, you want to isolate the attacker's movements and try to observe what the attacker is trying to accomplish and understand the behavior and thereby start around figuring out how to defend yourself against that, right? So looking at the behavior anomalies within an organization to look for internal threats. Some internal employee trying to upload data out, either by accident or by malice, and then figure out how do you respond and remediate at a very fast pace, which is your key to cyber resiliency. And at the top of the stack is threat hunting, where you're really looking for indicators of compromise across your network. Whether they exist or not, you're trying to get ahead of a problem before it ever eventually happens. These are all the different layers of the advanced cyber defense stack. This is where the attacker, sophisticated attacker of today is playing. And that's what BluSapphire focuses on.
That's a lot, and it's amazing that you're able to bring that all into one platform. Let me jump tracks for a second. I want to come back to BluSapphire's platform a little bit later, but let's jump over to what the current threat landscape looks like. Now, if you were talking to a room full of CISOs, what would you be telling them? Hey, these are the things that you should be concerned with most.
If I were talking to a room full of CISOs today, the trend seems to be going after the shiniest and the brightest tool that most organizations can get their hands on within the budgets they have. But what really CISOs should be focusing on, attacks are going to happen. It is a reality of life, right? And how quickly can you detect something going wrong within your environment? And how quickly can you respond to that problem? And how quickly can you address it? In other terms, remediate that problem. And that is far more important than spending your millions of dollars on going after the shiniest tool that anybody can come up with, right? And this is a very common theme we see and a very wrong approach to a security architecture, right? The age-old adage architecture model of defense in depth still holds good today, right? You really should plan your defense in depth, not just your perimeters, not just your cloud VPCs and so on and so forth. We're taking our archaic thought processes into the cloud also many a times, and this is causing inefficient use of the cloud and opening the cloud architectures for attacks also. And this is a challenge we see consistently. Focus more on the capabilities to detect, not necessarily protect. Protection is important, don't get me wrong. I mean, don't jump and choke my neck here, but protection is important. But while protection is important, you have to realize that protection doesn't always work. That's where you're looking at the vulnerabilities. These will never get patched. Some will get patched eventually, so on and so forth. These are actually tough problems to solve, right? So protection will eventually fail, but when it does fail, how quickly are you poised to detect these threats that are happening on your network? Because today's attackers are no longer relying on downloading malware to your environment, right? It may be a thing of the past. Most attackers today already use the utilities that are available within your network. So it's like getting into your kitchen, stealing a knife from your own kitchen's drawer and stabbing you in the chest, right? So this is what you really need to focus on. Figure out how quickly can you detect an anomaly within your network? how quickly can you resolve that problem? That is moving more towards cyber resilience, right? And that's what the boards are also today are interested in, right? The Economic Council Forum is also recommending, saying that you need attacks are eventually going to happen. You need to figure out how quickly can you detect, how quickly can you respond, and how quickly can you remediate.
Thank you for that. I mean, you make me think at what point are the tools uh, important versus the expertise? Because with every tool, there are different settings and policies that you can set up. And when you talk about anomaly detection, for example, I mean, how do you describe or define anomalous behavior in your specific organization? So let me ask you this. When you're working with a new customer, how much time and effort is it to deploy your platform? Or, I mean, it doesn't even have to be your platform, but how much attention should be on the getting the setup right versus just getting the right tool?
You ask a very challenging question there. The question is very simple, but the answer is extremely complicated, because majority of the times when we get into environments, we notice that they have not architected it right to protect themselves. And we do advise our clients when we see something missing there, and we say you need X, Y, and Z to address this. But all said and done, tools will only, I mean, including I'm a vendor, and I hate to be saying that, but no tool is actually a silver bullet, right? And case in point, we had a customer to whom our tool was constantly throwing out information saying, I am being attacked, and the customer never responded to any of that. And the tool has the capability to automatically remediate. They turned that feature off and said, no, we will deal with these things ourselves, and they never responded to it. And finally, one of our tools actually shut down the action of a ransomware as soon as it picked it up. And when you look at the trail, the marks were all over the place. The attacker has been going after their network for over 2 weeks before he finally got in. And every piece of information was right there. And it's more often than not the processes you put in place to learn your own environment, understand, and look at the data you're actually seeing and the skill to actually react to these threats, right? A tool can only do so much, right? As a tool, I can give you the entire context in terms of BluSapphire right today. You see a brute force, I can tell you, did you try something else before this? Or after brute force, was he successful in getting in? Or I can also tell you what else techniques he has used, and I can give you the entire context around it. But if you choose to look the other way, there is very little a tool can actually do for you. So getting the right processes in place, I think, is the top priority for any security organization for that matter. And this is where most organizations are starting to learn that they should actually move to a service model. And we are seeing a lot of shift in the security operations space, where majority of the security operations, including L2 and L3, are being moved to a service provider, and let the service provider handle all this. But if
Well,
you look at it,
that I was actually going to be one of my next questions, was talking about security as a service. So is it different depending on the size of the organization or the type of the organization? So I mean, just thinking, for example, regulated industries, they probably want to keep that stuff in-house, or is that changing too?
we see a lot of regulated industries starting to change that, right? I mean, we operate a lot in the supply chain for Department of Defense. We don't work directly with Department of Defense, but we do work with a lot of vendors who form the part of support supply chain for DoD. And it's highly regulated industry, and they are comfortably able to outsource because they have realized that they don't have the capacity to chase these. And we're talking about, when we talk about the supply chain also, I'm not talking about the tier one organizations, right? The Fortune 500 or the Fortune 1000 companies. These guys already have built armies of people to go after this problem. And they have matured in a way that there is so much technology debt that they're not ready to change right now. That's all right. Our target segment is really the mid tier, which is about 8 billion to 12 billion in revenue. Those are really ripe for attacks, and they're really not poised to protect themselves. And that's where we see major shift towards services in that area. And I think it is growing so fast that majority of the service providers are finding it hard to fill their order books.
Yeah, it's a very interesting trend. I mean, it kind of runs a little bit parallel and probably a few years behind just the movement to the cloud in general, right? I mean, you're outsourcing it's a big part of your IT infrastructure, and then now people or organizations are getting their mind around outsourcing security as well. Um, how does a platform like BluSapphires, for example, work alongside something like M365, Microsoft's 365, or their O365, which have a lot of tools, security tools, kind of baked into that platform? Microsoft also has things like, for example, Intune for the mobile device management, et cetera. How does your platform work alongside that?
And Microsoft does actually have a lot of tools, right? Azure Sentinel is something we compete with day in, day out at our client places, and we consistently seem to win against that because the per dollar value proposition and the visibility that BluSapphire provides seems to be superior. But I'll come to what the key differentiation is, right? So if you look at different tools that Microsoft provides, a lot of them are very broad-based. And a lot of work needs to be put in by a service provider to make them really operational because of the way the cloud operates, because of the way the cloud provider operates, right? So picture it this way, you cannot build something that is actually relative to a particular vertical when you are trying to cater to the entire world using a cloud provider, right? That becomes a challenge. We are able to provide a very threat-centric approach to the problem. Now, Azure, for that matter, and also AWS to a certain extent, has some of these capabilities baked in where they have the access controls, but who is monitoring these access controls, who is informing, who is alerting when these access controls are violated. And if you look at what Azure has in terms of Sentinel, it says, okay, fine, I can take data from A, B, and C, but what about those devices that are actually not on Azure? What about the inter-network traffic within Azure? What about the traffic between the data center and Azure? What about the traffic between the client and Azure? Who is taking care of that? What about the endpoints from where the compute is happening? Right, a large part of the data center compute has moved to Azure, but the client is still outside Azure. How about managing those? How do you manage all of this? These are very different challenges and they vary by vertical, right? If you're in a financial services organization, you look at this problem very differently versus if you are in a precision manufacturing, like catering to defense or somebody like that, or you're in aerospace or something like that, maybe healthcare. These are the challenges that we are able to address with ease in BluSapphire.
Awesome. Let me ask you this. Let's say that I'm a newly hired CISO for one of these organizations that you said are between $8 to $12 billion. Okay, one of your target organizations, and I have just been hired. I really don't have any understanding of the internal threat landscape, what exactly we have. I mean, some of the infrastructure has been diagrammed and kind of told me, uh, but what should I do first? What are the first three things that I should be doing to kind of get an understanding of what's going on and make sure that there's no major crises on the horizon?
I think the first thing you want to understand is what are your ingress egress points and how does your network architecture work? What are your key assets? So asset inventory almost every single time trumps everything else. You really need to understand what you have in place. And there are multiple ways to do this, right? I mean, if you're an Active Directory controlled environment and compare that data set with what you're seeing on your network, you very quickly realize there may you do not control. How do you bring those back into control and how do you manage your rogue assets? And how do you gain visibility of what kind of traffic moves between your data center and your own network, or maybe your cloud environment and your own network? And what other kinds of traffic are you seeing? So the network visibility becomes one of the key points to start with, because 99% of the time, you do not have any visibility or any understanding of the assets on your environment. The network is usually the only place that we say a single source of truth most of the time, because anything and everything that wants to communicate will send something on the network. So start with that single source of truth. We have sensors that we can help you gather that kind of information and help you understand what is really happening within your environment without getting into deploying the entire stack also if you wish to, right? So we will make a beginning there, learn your environment, and then start moving one step at a time.
Okay.
A lot of
Go ahead.
people would want to talk about vulnerabilities and others. Yes, those are important, absolutely true, and you need to close those vulnerabilities as quickly as you can. You will never be able to stop those, but focus really on trying to understand what doors and windows do you have open and who has already used them to come in and get out.
Okay, I think that's some excellent advice. Understand what, what's on your network, what are the key assets, and what activities taking place. What about IoT? I think that's like probably the most commonly mentioned concern of security professionals that I talk to these days. Is just, I mean, obviously there's an explosion of IoT devices, and things that we didn't even consider a couple of years ago are just popping up, and companies are using them they're just everywhere. So how, what are your thoughts in terms of how companies can adapt and protect?
I think NAC, network access control, really speaks loudly when it comes to IoTs. And identity management really speaks loudly when it comes to IoTs. Managing the identity of the device, understanding the identity, and then restricting that device based on its identity. Something tools like Cisco ICE and PX Grid do a good job of. Those become the central focus point when it comes to IoTs, because IoTs themselves have very little processing capability on them. They do represent a good amount of threat in terms of espionage, not necessarily to perform any DDoS or denial of service attacks or something like that, because they don't have the compute power. But they certainly do carry enough horsepower to probably perform espionage on your environment, learn about your environment, eavesdrop on your environment, so on and so forth, and give a bounce off point from where then an attacker can actually get into your data center with relative ease, depending on how misconfigured those devices are. So I think a combination of a network access control and identity-based access is really the key here. Most organizations tend to carve out a separate separate VLAN for these and directly let them out without giving them any access to the internal environment. But that's changing, right? A lot of these devices have started giving us, I think it's an age-old adage that convenience trumps security any given day. So the convenience these devices have started to provide far trumps the security requirements that exist on them. There are some standards that are cropping up today, but today the best way to still handle it is carve out a separate network. Don't let it talk to the internal network at all. Only communicate what you can manage. So a combination of the identity and network access control is the key when it comes to these IoT devices.
Makes a lot of sense. So let me ask you, when you go out and, I mean, actually, tell me a little bit about your business. You're active in the U.S. Where else are you active?
So today we are active in the US, Europe, mostly France and Italy seems to be really gearing up in terms of businesses in the mid-tier segments. And we're seeing a lot of activity in Middle East, along with a huge upheaval of investments in the defense sector in the Indian cybersecurity space also.
And are the concerns and the approaches and the questions similar across all markets, or do you find that some markets are more focused on, for example, detection versus protection, or versus some specific types of attacks, or is it pretty much generic concerns globally?
I would say the North American market is the most mature by far. That in our experience and the clients that we're talking to in each of these markets, the North American market is the most mature by far, and the Middle East is just playing catch up. The European market, their regulated, highly regulated environment makes them, and strict enforcement of these regulations actually makes them act more mature than their architectures really are. And Middle East, India, I think pretty much all of those countries are still playing catch up.
Okay, so when you talk about Europe, obviously every company in Europe, they've got to be compliant with GDPR if they're handling any kind of data at all. I mean, because even if it's not customer data, they have employees in Europe, they've got employee data. Their GDPR is on basically everybody's roadmap, and a big part of GDPR is having the adequate, excuse me, defense and response process and tools in place. So what you're saying is that that kind of forces European companies to be aware and adapt the right tools, even though maybe the rest of their platform maybe not as mature as what you're seeing in North America.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is correct, right? So because GDPR is not just a regulation, right? It is actually the law, and this is the first time, I think, first time ever in history, GDPR specifically calls out penal action against the chief data protection officer if there is a violation and the data leakage, right? And they're personally liable, as opposed to a fine or a regulatory fine or a slap on the wrist, which used to be the case before that. And I think New York has learned pretty decent with that. The New York financial regulation that has come into picture is making CISOs personally liable and the CEOs personally liable for any data leakage violations. But of course, there's still the question of in New York, you have to prove that the due diligence of care was not taken, which does not exist. That burden does not exist in the GDPR. So the action on the GDPR side is much higher, which is good. I mean, regulation always sells as a business. But what's more important is looking at security to really protect rather than just to adhere to some regulatory requirements. But as businesses go, the priority goes where the regulation is. And in those ways, we actually help customers reach a higher level of maturity with a lower dollar value attached to it, which really stands out. Because on a per dollar value, if you look at the value proposition of a unified platform versus multiple tools, the value is very, very clear, right? I mean, you can get access to the data, you can connect the dots much faster, you need less people to operate. These kind of advantages really stick out, and that really helps us because as a platform, when you onboard an entire platform as opposed to point tools, you're not saying I'm going to do Y only after I do X. You're bringing the whole stack in, which is increasing your capability as a SOC and improving your maturity from probably a level 1 all the way up to level 5. Of course, there remains the case of the skill set, and that's where the service providers are very fast addressing that gap, coming in with that shared skill set across the board, which customers can actually avail. Because it's not necessarily the requirement of the lack of money alone, right? The skill itself is in such a big shortage today in the security industry. There are not many people to go around who know what they're doing.
Yeah. So I'm curious, when you engage with new customers or potential customers, do you do some type of cost benefit analysis to say, hey, let's take a look at all the different tools that you're using, look at their licensing models, et cetera, and then what your TCO, total cost of ownership, is for that stack versus if we were going to run the BluSapphire Technologies platform, and then factor into the equation because their existing setup may require managed services. Obviously, if they're gonna bring in a new platform, they're probably going to need some consulting services as well. Do you do that kind of service, like some kind of cost benefit analysis?
Interestingly enough, though we started out doing it in the last 2.5 years, where we have really grown very fast, we have seen that the customers have also matured, right? I mean, the CISOs, the questions they're asking have matured. It's no longer handing over the security of their organization. It's more about, I want capability A, B, C, D, and E. Can you match that?
Right.
And can you do better? And if you can you show it to me, prove it to me? I don't want to take your word for it, show it to me. And once I see it, then I don't care who you are. So it's been 2.5 years, nobody has ever asked us, what does Gartner think of you, or where do you stand in the Gartner quadrant, or any of that. They have not happened. And it is a dramatic change from 4 years ago when we started. The first question anybody would ask was, okay, where do you stand in the Gartner quadrant? And I'm like, the reason I built the entire platform is because I'm tired of the Gartner quadrants looking at siloed approaches which are not leading to results in a security operations center. But today we don't get that question at all. I mean, almost none.
Excellent, excellent. Well, hey, one of the things that we would tell our customers when I was offering security consulting services is that improving your security posture, it's not an event, it's a process, right? And it's a journey. And so I'm going to jump tracks here and ask you about a journey, because I know, in preparing for the show, some of the notes mentioned that you, a few years ago, decided to, well, lose some weight and improve your health, and started running, and that you've run uh, apparently over 12 different marathons, including the Boston Marathon. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that? Because it's interesting for people who are founding companies and running companies, and I assume you probably have family as well, right? So you've got all this
Absolutely.
focus on work, and you have to be thinking about that 24/7. You also have your family, and sometimes it's hard to kind of balance and say, you know what, I also need to take care of myself. Uh, Tell us a little bit about your journey from basically, according to the notes here, that you were a bit overweight and you decided, hey, I'm gonna get in shape.
Uh, a bit overweight is to put it mildly. Yes. So I was at least 30 pounds overweight. And I've always been an asthma patient, and I did not know that. And it got revealed to me and really hit me in my face when I decided to go for a jog um, in Boston and near my sister's house. There was a nice beach, and there was a boardwalk, long boardwalk alongside the beach. And it was really uh, wonderful day. And I went for a very short jog, and I ended up wheezing like there was no tomorrow. I couldn't breathe. Went into an emergency, and they said, "Hey, didn't you know you had asthma and you're not supposed to get out in the cold?" And it came back as a shock to me. And me being overweight didn't help at all. So after my second son was born, I decided that I got to clean up my act and do take care of myself for my kids. And I'd like to be around. And I have two boys who are 14 and 11 today. And I'd like to be around and go to the gym with them and enjoy their youth along with them. And I realized if I maintain my lifestyle, that was not going to happen. It was really tough trying to train for a marathon like everything else. And I think really the consistency and the grit really paid off more than
Tell
anything else. I never ran even a mile in my life, never.
tell me
I
about
was
a little bit
always a
about
scout kid, and
tell me a
please
little
go
bit
ahead.
about your plan. Like, I mean, because you can't just, if you're going to run a marathon, you can't just say, okay, I'm going to go and run 24 miles. I mean, or 26, it's 26.2 miles, excuse me. But you've got to, what was your process?
So I decided to do something that nobody in my family ever did, and that was running a marathon. Um, and I started with the Couch to 5K program that's very popular on the internet.
Hmm.
And I realized immediately that I didn't even qualify for a Couch to 5K program. I couldn't even barely do what they wanted me to do on the day one. So I just really took it up as a challenge. It took me an entire year to slowly increase my capability to run consistently. And after a year, there I was running my first marathon in Connecticut in Hartford. Though it used to be the ING Hartford Marathon. And I never looked back after that.
That's awesome, man. I mean, in just 1 year, you were able to go from couch to marathon. And
And
you go ahead.
no, I was going to say, initially, the first 3 months were, I would say, brutal. The next three were like, wow, I can actually make some miles. And then you start preparing for your marathon, and then you realize that it is doable. It's just one leg in front of the other, and consistency pays off. Show up every day for your training, and it does work.
Yeah, and I got to say, it's one of the things that I love about sports is that It's real, and it gives you a reality check. And you can think that you're fit, and you can remember that when you were in high school and college, you used to do all these things. But when you get off the couch and go for that first jog, it's like it hits you. And it's nice to have that reality because, in the work, in a professional life, sometimes we don't really know you know what I mean? People, you get treated a
Exactly.
certain way, the customer tells you a certain thing, and what's reality? But reality is when you get off that sofa and try to do that jog. But the other thing I like about it is you get real feedback in terms of your improvements, right, and your effort and what you put into it. You get back out of it. A year and a half ago, I decided to get into cycling, and I just did my goal was 500 miles total for the first 6 months. Start off very humble. That's less than 100 miles a month. But then my next 6 months, I went up to 1,000 miles, and the next 6 months, I went up to 2,000. And it just becomes a habit. And now I'm doing like 400 miles a month, mostly on the trail, and I love it. And I can look at my times and see improvement. And so it's like one thing that's real. Do you use any apps like Strava or anything like that?
So I used to have a app called My Coach from Adidas.
Mm-hmm.
I loved it before Nike bought it, and I'm just still tied into. So nostalgia, and I still use Nike app. It's not really great, but I just got so used to that app now that I just can't look at anything else. For more than anything else, I think right now my iWatch does everything for me. Nothing more, nothing less, and I'm not interested in looking at anything else. But one thing I have on my to-do list is to jump onto cycle and start pedaling. I haven't done that in a very long time. I really look forward to getting back to cycling because I think I'm starting to hurt my knees a little bit as I age.
Yeah.
And my doctor says, no, no, pick up cycling. It actually does the same thing it does for you and improves your cardio and everything. As you rightly said, right? I mean, it's very, very real when you get out there. And it's instant feedback, brutal instant feedback most of the times in the beginning. And you start to enjoy the results of it very fast.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, your results are definitely inspiring. And I think that to kind of come full circle on this, having a platform like BluSapphire Technologies that provides instant feedback to your security operations team in terms of what's our status, what's the signal we're receiving, how we're going to respond to it, gives you that reality check. And you mentioned earlier that CISOs and DPOs, for example, are increasingly becoming in placed in positions of potential responsibility, legal responsibility, possibly financial responsibility uh, for breaches that maybe they should have prevented, or for reporting breaches that they didn't report, etc. And if I was in one of those positions, the the importance of quote unquote reality and understanding what's going on would be incredibly important, because otherwise I couldn't sleep at night. If I thought that maybe things were okay, just kind of like I thought that I was in pretty good shape because I used to be able to run when I was in high school or college, I wouldn't be able to sleep well. But just having a tool that says, hey, this is the real situation is important. And I'm not saying that any tool out there can do that completely, but it's better to have something that gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on than just kind of guesstimating. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely it does. And as you're talking, I was thinking about my entrepreneurial journey. And I think my years of running has really helped me maintain the grit it needs to push yourself constantly and stay in the game rather than drop out and finish it. And I think that's what helped us succeed, because COVID gave us a really big root shock in 2020 when we were all prepared. We went all out and spent every penny we had into our SaaS. And then COVID hit, and the lean period started for about 6 months. And we were like, oh my God, what's happening?
Right.
And then we started to pick back up again. And now we have, I think, or 300% of where we were during COVID times. So I think we've done pretty well, and I think that grit pays off. And if I were to share one thing with anybody who's listening to this podcast is stay with it, show up, and it pays off. Doesn't matter whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're an employee, whatever the case might be, or you're very career focused, or you're in sports. It's that showing up every day makes a huge difference.
I think that's some amazing advice. Let me ask you this: if any of our listeners want to get more information about BluSapphire's technologies or connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Reach out on LinkedIn. We have a very attentive staff, or you can email me directly at kiran@blusapphire.com. I respond pretty good to emails. I'm not a big social person with respect to other social tools, but I respond to my email very diligently.
Awesome. Well, hey, Kiran, I've really enjoyed this conversation and impressed both with your business and athletic success. Wish you and your whole team a great remainder of 2022.
Hey, thank you very much, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.